All right, so today we're diving into something that I think we've all experienced at some point, uh, resentment and how to deal with it when it's directed at you.
Oh, yeah.
It's never a picnic.
No, not at all. And this source really brings up some interesting points about, what resentment actually is, because it's not just anger. It's deeper than that.
Right, it's not just like, oh, I'm annoyed with you. It's like this simmering negativity.
Exactly. It's like a wound that never quite heals. It keeps getting reopened.
Yes, and it
Yeah.
kind of colors the way that person sees you and interacts with you. So how can we tell
But
if
worse.
somebody's just having a bad day or if they're actually carrying around this resentment towards us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's where I think these phases of resentment that the source talks about come in, and there's three of them,
Hmm.
and they kind of manifest in different ways, but they're all driven by that same underlying resentment. And the
Yeah.
first one is mockery,
Okay.
which we've all probably
Oh,
experienced.
everything. Yeah.
Yeah,
I was going to say, who hasn't shared some good news and then gotten kind of a backhanded compliment?
exactly. Or a
Okay.
sarcastic remark,
Yeah, like the source uses the example of somebody getting a promotion,
Yeah.
and then the person they're telling says, oh, it must be nice to have all that extra work.
Right.
Like, ouch.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that inability to just be happy for you.
Yeah.
They have to kind of tear you down a little bit.
It's like they can't handle your win
Exactly.
because it somehow diminishes them in their mind, even if it has nothing to do with them.
Right. And then it's often, it's not always like a huge blow up argument. It's these microaggressions,
Yeah.
these little subtle digs that can really chip away at you over time,
Yeah, I think it's a good point to pay attention to how these interactions make you feel,
Yes.
even if you can't put your finger on why they feel off.
Exactly. Trust your gut.
Yeah.
So, mockery, that's one face of resentment. The other one the source talks about is envy. And this is even trickier, I think, because it's often tied to this idea that you don't deserve what you have.
Oh, wow.
It's not just wanting what you have, it's this belief that you've somehow gotten it unfairly.
So it's like they're almost holding you responsible for their own unhappiness,
Exactly.
even if like your success has nothing to do with their lack of it.
Absolutely. And it can lead to some pretty destructive behaviors. That the source mentions the story of Cain and Abel,
Right.
which, obviously an extreme example, but it illustrates how powerful this emotion can be
Yeah.
and how warped thinking can become
Oh, yeah.
when, resentment and envy take hold. We're not saying everyone's going to turn into a murderer,
Right.
but it shows you how powerful these emotions can be.
So how do we protect ourselves? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm all for like, understanding where somebody's coming from. But at a certain point, doesn't self-preservation kick in?
It absolutely does. And that's why recognizing these signs is so crucial. Once you start
Yeah.
to see those patterns, the mockery, the envy,
Yeah.
it's a signal to start setting some serious boundaries,
Right.
because resentment can be contagious.
That's a good point.
And if you're not careful, it can start to poison your own outlook.
So we can't control somebody else's resentment, but we can control how much we allow ourselves to be exposed to it.
Exactly.
Okay, so this brings us to the third phase of resentment, and I think this is the one that people kind of immediately think of, which is rage.
Rage, yeah. And while it can be, a full-blown outburst, the source also talks about how it often shows up in more subtle ways.
Yeah.
Passive aggression,
Uh-huh.
the silent treatment, but just a general aura of hostility.
Yeah, it's like walking on eggshells. You never know
Right.
what's going to set them off.
Exactly. And that's a huge red flag.
Yeah.
Because, and the source mentions the work of Dr. Firestone, who talks about the critical inner voice
Okay.
that we all have, and resentment basically amplifies that voice. It makes it louder, more negative.
Oh, wow.
So not only are you dealing with their outward expressions of anger,
But their resentment might actually be feeding into your own self-doubt.
it's like a double whammy.
Exactly, a double whammy of negativity coming at you from both sides.
So how do we break free from this?
Well, that's where the source shifts from, identifying the problem to actually offering some solutions.
Okay, good, because I was about to say,
Yeah.
we need a life raft here.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where it gets really valuable, I think,
Yeah.
for our listeners, because it's like, okay, we see the problem now. What can we do about it?
Yeah.
And one of the first things the source really emphasizes is remembering that someone else's resentment, it's not about you.
Oh.
It's about them. It's about their own internal struggles,
yeah.
their unmet needs, their unresolved issues
Yeah.
that are really driving that negativity.
That's easier said than done, though, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, when someone's spewing resentment in your direction, it's hard not to take it personally.
It is It's human nature to feel hurt and defensive when someone's directing negativity towards us, even if we know intellectually, like,
Yeah.
okay, this isn't really about me.
And that's why the source talks about the importance of self-respect.
Okay.
Because if we have a strong sense of self-worth,
Yeah.
those resentful barbs are less likely to pierce our armor, you
Yeah,
know?
because if you know you're a good person and you're doing your best, then it's like, yeah, whatever.
Right, and that ties directly into setting boundaries.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that you have the right to protect yourself from that emotional onslaught, even if it means distancing yourself from someone you care about.
So let's talk about boundaries, because I know it's like a buzzword these days, but what does that actually look like
Right.
in practice, especially when we're talking about someone who's like deeply resentful?
Yeah. Well, it starts with recognizing what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not.
Okay.
Are you okay with being the target of their subtle digs and their backhanded compliments?
Right.
Are you willing to constantly walk on eggshells around them, afraid to trigger their rage?
You know what I'm realizing as we're talking about this is I have spent way too much energy trying to appease resentful people in my life,
Yeah.
hoping they'll magically change.
Right.
But that doesn't seem to be what the source is suggesting as like a path to success.
No, it's a recipe for disaster.
Okay.
Because you're essentially giving them permission to continue treating you poorly.
Yeah.
And resentment, it thrives on negativity.
Right.
So the more you engage with it, the more you feed it.
Oh, that's a good point.
So how do we break that cycle?
Yeah, do we have to cut these people out of our lives complete? I mean, that sounds harsh, especially if we're talking about family or close friends.
It's not about being harsh. It's about being honest with yourself about what you need
Okay.
to protect your own well-being. And sometimes that means creating distance, even if it's temporary.
Right.
It might involve limiting context, setting clear boundaries around certain topics of conversation,
Yeah.
or even walking away from the relationship entirely if it's become too toxic.
I mean, that's a tough pill to swallow, but
Yeah.
I see the wisdom in that. You know, the source seems to be saying, like, sometimes the kindest thing you can do
Yes.
for yourself and for the other person is to create space for them to deal with their own stuff
Exactly.
without dragging you down with them.
You can't force someone to change, and you certainly can't heal their resentment for them.
Right.
But you can choose to protect yourself from its impact on your life.
Okay, so we've talked about recognizing the signs, cultivating self-respect, setting boundaries. Are there other strategies that the source recommends for dealing with this sticky situation?
Yeah, there are a few more that I think are really powerful, and one is to focus on building relationships with people who are genuinely supportive and uplifting.
Okay.
It's like that saying, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that.
And if you're constantly surrounded by negativity and resentment, it's bound to seep into your own outlook.
So it's about being mindful of who we're letting into our inner circle. Choosing to spend time with people who lift us up,
Yes.
not drag us down.
And that ties into another piece of advice from the source, which is focus on your own growth and well-being.
Oh, yeah?
You know, instead of getting caught up in the drama of someone else's resentment, invest in your own happiness. Pursue your passions. Surround yourself with people who make you feel good about yourself.
It's like taking back control of your own narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the final piece of advice, and I think this is the most powerful, is to cultivate compassion.
Okay.
Both for yourself and for the person who's resentful.
Compassion for the person who's making our life miserable.
I know it sounds counterintuitive.
How is that even possible?
But hear me out. You know, the source reminds us that hurt people.
Okay.
Often, the people who are most resentful are carrying a lot of pain and baggage themselves.
Right.
It doesn't excuse their behavior,
Right.
but it can help us understand where it's coming from.
So it's like their resentment is a symptom of a deeper wound, even if they're not consciously aware of it.
And when we can see them through that lens of compassion, it becomes a little easier to detach from their negativity and focus on our own well-being.
That's a really powerful shift in perspective.
Yeah.
So we're not condoning their behavior, but we're simply recognizing that their resentment
Right.
is a reflection of their own internal struggles,
Exactly.
not a personal attack on us.
And by cultivating compassion, we create a little more space for understanding and a little less space for anger and resentment to take root in our own hearts.
That's a really good point. Wow. This has been so insightful. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Recognizing the signs, setting boundaries, cultivating self-respect, choosing our circle, wisely focusing on our own well-being,
Yes.
and even finding compassion for the person who's resentful.
It's a whole toolkit
It is.
for navigating this tricky emotion.
And you mentioned earlier that the source doesn't talk about forgiveness explicitly,
Right.
but that a lot of these strategies kind of indirectly lead us in that direction.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear more about that. You mentioned that the source doesn't explicitly talk about forgiveness,
Right.
but that a lot of these strategies kind of indirectly lead us in that direction.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear more about that.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because when we think about forgiveness, we often picture this huge, gesture of reconciliation, like something out of a movie.
Right.
But what the source seems to be suggesting is that true forgiveness is often a much quieter, more internal process.
So it's not about condoning the other person's behavior
Right.
or letting them off the hook.
No.
It's more about releasing ourselves from the grip of that resentment.
Exactly, because when we hold on to resentment,
Yeah.
we're essentially allowing that person to continue hurting us, even if they're no longer actively doing anything wrong.
Right.
It's like we're giving them power over our emotional well-being.
Like we're carrying that weight around with us.
Yeah,
And it's exhausting.
it is.
But how do we actually let go of that resentment?
Right.
It's not just a switch we can flip, right?
Right. It's definitely a process and it takes time and effort. But I think the source's emphasis on self-respect, boundaries, and compassion really lays the groundwork for forgiveness to take root.
Because when we prioritize our own well-being
Yeah.
and cultivate understanding,
Yes.
we're essentially creating the space for healing to occur.
Exactly. It's like we're shifting our focus from the hurt and the anger to a place of acceptance and peace. And that doesn't mean we forget what happened
Right.
or condone the behavior, but we're choosing to release the emotional hold it has over us.
So it's about reclaiming our power, right?
Absolutely.
Choosing to define our own narrative instead of letting someone else's actions dictate how we feel.
Exactly. And I think that's the most empowering message of all, because ultimately we have the choice to forgive even if the other person never apologizes or acknowledges their wrongdoing.
And that's a powerful place to be.
It is, because true peace comes from within, not from external circumstances or other people's actions. And when we can tap into that inner peace, we become less reactive to the resentment of others and more resilient in the face of life's challenges.
This has been such an insightful deep dive.
It has.
We've explored the various faces of resentment,
Yes.
the psychological mechanisms that drive it, and most importantly, the strategies we can use to protect ourselves
Yes.
from its harmful effects.
And remember, the journey doesn't end here.
Right.
These are tools that you can continue to use and refine as you navigate your own relationships and personal growth.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to reflect on the insights that we've shared today.
Yes.
Consider how these strategies might apply to your own life and your own relationships. What steps can you take to cultivate more self-respect, set healthier boundaries, and choose peace, even in the face of resentment?
Because ultimately, you have the power to create a life filled with joy, connection, and resilience, regardless of the challenges you may face.
And on that note of empowerment and hope, we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. And remember, keep choosing peace.